He rode into Calder's Bend under a name that wasn't his, and the one woman who knew it was a lie watched from the porch. She did not raise an alarm. She did not reach for a gun. She watched the tired dark horse come up her lane at dusk, watched the man slumped in the saddle with one hand resting where a holster should have been and wasn't. She set a second plate on the table before he ever said a word. Her name was Ruth Calder. She had buried a husband and a marshal, and most of her hope in the same hard year. And she knew exactly who had just ridden into her yard, because she had a letter in the front of a worn leather book that told her. The man called himself Jesse Doan. That was not his name either, but it was the name he meant to die under. Quiet, on some piece of ground nobody would come looking for. He had spent 10 years on the wrong side of a gun, riding with men whose names ended up on courthouse walls. Somewhere in the last of those 10 years, a thing inside him had simply worn through. He had ridden away from the Marsh gang one cold morning while they slept, taken nothing but his horse and the clothes he stood in, pointed himself at the emptiest country he could find. Calder's Bend was the end of the line. He asked the woman on the porch for work and for no questions, and he was prepared to be turned away. "There's a bunk in the barn and supper on the table," Ruth said. "I need a man who can gentle horses and won't run his mouth in town. The pay is poor and the work is hard. If that suits you, you can start at first light." It suited him. He did not understand why she had not even asked his business, and he was too tired to question a kindness. He ate at her table that night with his hat off and his eyes down, and he did not see her glance once at the worn leather book on the shelf by the door, the book with the folded letter sewn into the front cover, the letter a dying marshal had written her with the last of his strength. He did not know that the marshal had been her cousin. He did not know that the letter named him. He did not know that the woman who had just given him a bed was the one soul in the territory who could put a rope around his neck with a single trip to the county seat and had decided, watching him slump up her lane, not to. The town found out she had hired a stranger by the end of the week. The town did not like it. Calder's Bend was a small place that had learned to be afraid. A widow alone on a failing horse ranch with a drifter she'd taken on without a reference was exactly the kind of thing it liked to talk about. Hollis Vane, who ran the bank and held the paper on half the valley, made a point of riding out to look the new man over, and what he saw was a quiet fellow breaking a green colt in the round pen, with a patience that the bank could not foreclose on. That patience annoyed Hollis Vane more than insolence would have. "You want to be careful, Mrs. Calder," Vane said from his horse, loud enough for the hands to hear. "A woman alone, a man nobody knows, folks will say things." He smiled the smile of a man who intended to be the folks who said them. Drifter and the widow, that's what they're already calling it down at the Mercantile. Ruth stood in her navy dress at the rail with the worn leather book against her chest. She did not flinch. "Folks have called me worse since I buried Tom," she said. "I'm still here. So's the ranch. You can ride on, Mr. Vane." He rode on. The nickname stuck the way cruel things do. By the next Sunday half the Bend was calling the new man the Drifter and laying small bets at the Mercantile on how long it would be before he robbed her blind and ran. The bets were never unkind to his face. They didn't need to be. A small town can ride a person off without ever raising its voice. And the Drifter felt the verdict settle over him every time he rode in for nails or salt, the way you feel a cold draft from a door you can't see. The Mercantile man counted his coin out onto the counter instead of into his hand. The smith took the other fellow's horse first, though the man had come in second. Nobody said a word he could answer. They simply let him understand in 100 small, wordless ways, that he was a thing the town was waiting to be rid of. He took it the way he took weather. He paid his bill, touched his hat to no one in particular, and rode back out to the one place in the valley where a person looked at him and did not see a verdict. What the town did not know, and what the man himself did not yet believe, was that he had no intention of robbing anyone ever again. He worked. He was up before her and asleep after the last lamp. The green colts that had been eating money came back, gentled and sound, and sold for real coin at the spring sale. He mended the fence Tom Calder had let go, dug out the choked spring at the head of the draw, and stood between the ranch and its ruin with nothing but work, because work was the only honest thing he had left, and he was holding to it like a drowning man holds to a board. If you have ever watched a town decide a person was no good before that person was given a single fair morning to prove otherwise, the drifter, the widow, the one the mercantile already had a name for, and quietly wanted to see them stand up straight and be right, then you already belong here, and you ought to take a moment to subscribe, because the overlooked person, turning out to be the one worth choosing, is the only kind of story I tell on this channel. Now ride the rest of this one with me, because Ruth Calder was holding a letter that was going to come due before the snow did. She watched him close through that first month, looking for the turn a person like him was bound to take. She had reason to. The letter in the front of her book was not a sentiment. Her cousin, Marshal Aaron Pike, had spent 4 years chasing the Marsh gang across 3 territories, and the last thing he had done before a bullet outside Laramie finished him was write her a letter and have it carried to her by a deputy he trusted. She had read it so many times the creases had gone soft. He had written that the gang was breaking apart, that one of them had ridden off alone, that this one was different, had twice turned to robbery before it turned to killing, had once left a payroll behind, rather than shoot a clerk who'd gone for help. Pike had written that if a man like that ever came her way looking to be left alone, she might think hard before she handed him to the rope, because the rope was cheap and a changed man was not. And Pike had written the name, the real one, so that she would know him when he came. She knew him the moment he came up the lane, and every day after, she weighed the man in front of her against the man in the letter. Every day the scale tipped the same way. There was a colt on the place that the bank's man had told her to shoot. A leggy bay 2-year-old, ruined by a previous breaker who'd whipped fear into him until he struck at anything that came near the rail. Worthless and dangerous, $100 of meanness-eating hay she could not spare. The new hand did not shoot him. He took a stool and a length of rope out to the round pen, and he sat. He sat the first morning until noon, doing nothing, just letting the colt learn that a man could be in the pen, and the man would not hurt him. He sat the second morning the same. On the 4th day, the bay walked up behind him and breathed on the back of his neck, and the man did not so much as turn his head, and Ruth, watching from the kitchen window with her hands gone still in the dishwater, understood that she was looking at a man teaching, a frightened thing that not everything with 2 hands meant harm. By the end of the month, the ruined colt would follow him across the yard like a dog. The bank's man, riding past, said it was a waste of a morning. Ruth thought it was the truest thing she had seen a man do in a long time. He carried old Wedge, her one ancient ranch hand, 3 miles on his own back when Wedge's horse threw him and broke his leg in the high pasture, and never once mentioned it after. Wedge mentioned it. Wedge, who had not trusted a stranger since the war, sat with his splinted leg up on a chair by the stove and told Ruth that any man who'd haul a useless old wreck down off a mountain when it would have been easier to ride for help and leave him to the cold, was a man she ought to keep. He would not take the last of anything at the table. He fixed the things that were broken without being asked and never named the bill. A man playing a part slips. This one never slipped because he was not playing a part. He had simply decided to be a different man and was doing it the only way it can be done, one plain hard day at a time, with nobody watching but a woman he didn't know was watching. The truth came out of him slowly, the way truth does when a person has spent a decade keeping it down. It came out a piece at a time over the wood stove on long nights. Scar explained in 4 flat words, a flinch at a name, a story told sideways as if it had happened to somebody else. She let it come. She never pushed, and she never pretended she didn't understand more than he was saying. And one night, in the deep cold of January, when the wind was tearing at the eaves and the coffee had gone bitter in the pot, he set down his cup and told her plainly that he was not Jesse Doan, that he had ridden with bad men and done things he could not undo, and that if she wanted him gone by morning he would understand it, he would go without a word. Ruth got up. She took the worn leather book down from the shelf. She opened it to the front cover, drew out the folded letter, and laid it open on the table in front of him under the lamp. "I know who you are," she said. "I've known since the night you rode in. My cousin was the marshal who hunted you. He wrote me your name before he died." She watched his face go the color of ash. "He also wrote that you weren't like the others, that you'd turn things twice when turning cost you. If you ever came my way looking to be let alone, I should think hard before I gave you to the rope." She put one finger on the letter. "I've thought hard, mister." And she said his real name then, quietly once, the only time she ever said it out loud, for 4 months. "The letter says you can be hanged on what's written here. It also says you might be worth the not hanging. I decided which I believed the first night, when you took your hat off at my table like a man who remembered how. I just kept the letter so you'd know I chose. Not so you'd be afraid." He sat a long time with the lamp between them and the wind in the eaves and the letter open on the table, a dead man's handwriting saying he was worth saving, a living woman saying she'd already saved him and asked nothing for it. He had braced his whole life for the moment someone learned what he was. He had never once imagined that the someone would have known all along, stayed. That should have been the turn. It was not, quite, because the past does not honor a man's decision to leave it. The Marsh gang had not forgotten that one of theirs rode off in the night, and a man named Cobb Marsh did not let go of anything that was his. A careless word in a Laramie saloon put the name of a horse ranch near Calder's Bend into the wrong ears that February. They came at the end of the month, 4 of them, riding in at dusk the way he had ridden in, except they came for him, and they came armed. He saw the dust first. He had been watching that road for 10 years without knowing he was watching it. He knew the shape of riders who meant harm. He told Ruth to take Wedge and go to the root cellar and bar it. She did not go. She went instead to the wall where Tom Calder's old rifle hung, took it down, loaded it with steady hands, and stood in the doorway of her own house. There was no argument in her face that he could win. Cobb Marsh sat his horse in the yard and called the man out by his real name, loud across the dark, the name nobody in the Bend knew, and offered him a choice: ride back to the gang and the old life, or be left in the dust of a widow's ranch with the law none the wiser, since the gang surely wouldn't tell it and the widow surely couldn't. It was, in its way, a generous offer. It was the past holding the door open and asking him to walk back through. He did not walk back through. He stepped down off the porch into the lamplight, where they could all see him plain, and he told Cobb Marsh that the man Cobb was looking for had died on the road north some months back, and that what stood here now was a ranch hand who would not have his name shouted across his employer's yard. He said it quiet. He said it with empty hands. And when Cobb Marsh decided that an answer like that earned a bullet, it was Ruth Calder in the doorway who fired first into the dirt at the led horse's feet, and the night came apart in noise and powder smoke. It was over fast, the way those things are. When the smoke thinned, one of the gang was down and groaning. Cobb Marsh was clutching a shoulder the ranch hand's old skill had put a ball through. The two still horsed had decided a gentled widow's ranch was a far worse place to die than they'd reckoned. They took their wounded, and they rode. They did not come back. And the man stood in the yard with a borrowed gun gone cold in his hand and understood, finally, all the way down, that he had chosen, and that the choosing had held even with the old life sitting horsed in front of him, offering to take it all back. By dawn, the gunfire had carried to town, and the town came out to look, expecting to bury a foolish widow and her thieving drifter. Instead found the widow making coffee, and the drifter, splinting the leg of a man he'd shot rather than killed, waiting on the county sheriff he himself had sent a boy to fetch. The sheriff came. The wounded outlaw, ungrateful and afraid, spat out the ranch hand's real name in front of the whole assembled bend, the name that could still, even now, end him. And Ruth Calder stepped forward in her navy dress with the worn leather book against her chest and opened it and drew out Marshal Aaron Pike's letter, handed it to the sheriff to read aloud. If you have ever watched someone get written off by the very people who should have looked closer, stay with me, because this is the part of the story I have been waiting to tell you, and it turns everything. The sheriff read it in the yard with the whole town listening. He read a dead marshal's own hand naming the man, yes, but naming him as the one who turned, the one who left, the one worth a second look. He read Pike's plain judgment that the territory would be better served by a changed man working honest ground than by another body on a courthouse wall. A marshal's word carried weight a frightened outlaw's did not, and a dead marshal's written word, witnessed and dated and addressed to his own kin, carried the most weight of all. The sheriff folded the letter and looked a long time at the man standing quiet by the splinted leg. Then he looked at Hollis Vane and the mercantile men who had named him the Drifter. He said that as far as the county was concerned, the man who'd worn that name had died on the road north. The man standing here had just done the law's work for it, and that he'd thanked the good people of Calder's Bend to remember which of them had bet against a widow and lost. Hollis Vane found he had pressing business at the bank. The man did not gloat. He had no idea how. He stood with his hat in his hands while the town rearranged its opinion of him in real time. The only thing he said was to ask after the man he'd shot whether the leg would mend. It would. Ruth folded the letter and put it back in the front of the worn leather book where she kept the things that proved a person was real. She did not say a word, because she had said her one word already, on a cold night by lamplight, and it had been enough. Spring came up the draw, and the choked spring he dug out ran clear, and the gentled colts brought the best price the ranch had seen since Tom Calder was alive. At the trail's end auction in town that spring, when the Calder horses went for top dollar and the buyers tipped their hats to the man who debroken them. Old Wedge stood at the rail and told anyone who'd listened that he'd known the fellow was sound the day he got carried 3 miles down, mountain on a stranger's back. The mercantile found other things to talk about, as towns will. The nickname died the quiet death of a joke that turned out to be on the ones who told it. He asked her to marry him in the fall, the head of the draw by the spring he'd freed, and it was not a grand thing. He told her he had nothing to offer that the country hadn't already tried to take, a used-up name and a pair of hands, that he understood if it wasn't enough. She told him she'd had his real name in her book for a year and a half, and had never once been tempted to use it against him, and that a woman who keeps a man's worst secret safe through a whole hard winter is generally trying to tell him something. They were married by the circuit preacher under the cottonwood by the spring. The only paper that mattered that day was an old folded letter in the front of a worn leather book, a dead marshal's last act, saying a thing the living had taken a winter to prove. Years on, when the ranch was theirs together and had been for a long time, a young hand new to the place found the worn leather book on the mantel and asked Ruth why she kept an old letter folded in the front of it like a deed. She took it down and showed him the dead marshal's hand, the creases gone soft from reading, the plain, hard sentence that a changed man was worth more than a cheap rope. She told him a man she had never met had spent the last of his strength asking her to look closer at a stranger, and that she had, and that the looking had given her the best years of her life. The young hand asked if she'd ever been afraid, hiring a wanted man on nothing but a dead cousin's word. She thought about it. I had the letter, she said, and I had my own 2 eyes. They agreed. A woman who has those 2 things doesn't have to be afraid of what a town will say. She ran one finger down the soft crease. Somewhere in here, a man who hunted the worst of the world still believed the worst of it could turn. You go into a hard winter a lot less alone, when a dead man already wrote down that he believed in the both of you. The sun was going down over the draw, over the freed spring and the honest grass and the horses he had gentled moving easy toward the water. He came in from the corrals and set his hat on its nail. Ruth closed the worn leather book and set it back on the mantel. The marshal's letter folded safe in the front, the whole story of how a written-off man was looked at, twice held quiet between 2 covers. A name can be carried west and buried in the clay. A man only stays buried if you let him. So I'll leave you with the question that first night in Calder's Bend always leaves me with. If a stranger with a hard past rode up your lane at dusk asking only to be let alone, would you reach for the rope the law and the town would hand you? Or would you do the harder, wiser thing, look long enough to see whether the man in front of you might already have changed? If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments which one you'd be. And if you want another story about the overlooked person turning out to be the one worth choosing, it's right here, waiting for you.